Hey everyone, and welcome to part 3 of this video series where we learn how to make this Pokedex using Material UI and React. So far, if you remember, what we have done is we've essentially set up all the routing, so when the route is just slash, we sort of see our Pokedex, and when the route is something else, we can actually see that it's the Pokemon page. And the next thing we've done is we've sort of set out the general layout for the Pokedex. We have a little app bar at the top, we also have cards in the middle that are evenly spaced out by grid, the same way that they're going to be when we have our actual components. And in this part, we are essentially going to be using our mock data to sort of lay everything out and style everything so that it looks like this, just without all the data. So this is by far the sort of meat of the entire tutorial. The next one after that, we're going to be actually, instead of using mock data, hooking it up to the API request so we get all of this good stuff. And then the final one, we're actually going to set up the search bar so that you can type in, for example, like CHR, CHA, and get all the Pokemon that have CHA in their name and be able to click on any one of them to see their entire profile. So once again, before we jump into it actually, once again, if you found value in this videos or these series, I know I've said it so many times, but it really helps with the YouTube algorithm. I can't tell you how much it helps enough if you either like, subscribe, or leave a comment. But yeah, let's jump into it. So the next thing we sort of want to do here is let's go ahead and hook up our mock data. So the first thing we can do is sort of import our mock data. So import mock data from /mock data. And now, wrong file. So we want to do this in the Pokedex. So for now, we pretty much specifically want to work inside of the Pokedex. So we're going to come here, we're going to import that mock data right down here. And the next thing I'm going to do is I want a state variable that's going to sort of keep track of all this data. So when we're actually pulling data from the backend or from the API, we're going to have that data come from elsewhere. But for now, we're going to set the default state to just mock data. So you can see here I have Pokemon data, a variable called Pokemon data. And it pretty much has a getter setter. If you're not familiar with the hook use state, it's pretty much something that's built into React. And it's what replaces state in class-based components. And we're going to set a default value to just our mock data. And the next thing we are going to do is essentially let's start setting up everything. So at the bottom here, first of all, we only want to render sort of this grid with all the stuff inside of it if we have our Pokemon data to begin with. If we're thinking ahead in the future when we're pulling stuff from the API, that data isn't always going to be there because it takes time to get the data. And if it's not there, we want it to show, let's say, for example, a loading bar. And Material UI has a really good built-in loading bar called Circular Progress. It's really cool. You've probably seen it before on a lot of Google products. But if we just come here, you'll see that here's what the circular progress bar looks like. So what we're going to do is we're going to wrap all this grid stuff that we did in the last video in a conditional. So I'm going to go ahead and say Pokemon data, and we're going to have a ternary statement. So the way a ternary statement works is whatever comes inside these brackets after the question mark will be if Pokemon data is not undefined. Everything that comes after the colon will be if it is undefined. So if it is, let's do the other case first. So if it's not undefined, well, we just want to proceed the way we always were. But if it is undefined, we want to just display our circular progress. And let's see if that auto imported correctly. It did. And that's pretty much it. So that's normally how easy it is to ensure that when your data is loading, it will show us circular progress. And because we haven't hooked it up to the API, we can't see it yet. But if I were to just pass in a default thing of undefined here, you'll see that when this value is undefined, it'll show a nice little loading bar there. So let's go ahead and put this back. And now over here, what we're going to do is right now we're just displaying a bunch of random cards essentially. We want to break that down with real data. So what we're going to do is, if you remember the way our data looks, you can see here that it is an object and each key corresponds to a Pokemon ID. And within that object, within that Pokemon ID object, that key value pair, the value is going to be all the data for that Pokemon. So you really have an object of objects here. So what we want to do is we want to map through all the data and we want to display a card separately and specifically for every single Pokemon that we have. So what we can go ahead and do here is Because it's not an array, in order to map through it, we're going to have to use the keys of the map itself, the keys of the object itself. And the way you do that is by doing object.keys. So we can pass in our Pokemon data, and we can go ahead and map through that. So let's map through that. And our variable that we're going to get when we map through that is pretty much the Pokemon ID, because that is essentially the values for the default, the keys for our default map that we have here, our default object that we have going on here. And inside of here, for each Pokemon ID, well, what we're going to do is we're essentially just going to call, it's going to be very simple. We're just going to call get Pokemon card. And we're going to pass in our Pokemon ID in here. And in our get Pokemon card function that we set up last video, we're going to take in Pokemon ID. So you'll see here nothing's really changed. The only thing that we get here is that we need a unique key. So we can go ahead. Whenever you map through something, you have to set the first child of it with a key, or else you'll get a nice little console error here. So in our case, our key is just going to be the Pokemon ID. Because that is something that is unique to every single card that will be displayed here, the ID of the Pokemon that it corresponds to. So now in our get Pokemon card function, we can go ahead and console.log Pokemon data, and in square brackets, we can put the Pokemon ID interpolated as a string. The only reason we're doing that right now is because in the mock data, I had it as a string, but in the real data, it comes back as a number. So we'll change that in the next video when we're adding the real data. But as you can see here, all the data about the Pokemon is right here. So this is pretty cool. Each card has all the data every time this gets called, which should be the same amount of times as Pokemon there are, since we're mapping through the Pokemon data. It has all the data it needs to sort of display it. So let's get started on actually displaying the data. First thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to import card media at the top here, and card media is essentially what we are going to use to have this icon in there, just like that. The next thing we're going to want to do is destructure the information we need from this object. So we can go ahead down here and we can pretty much, the information we're going to want to pull out are three things for now. Number one, the ID, the name, and the sprite. So for the ID and name, they can come straight from this object. And we'll make sure that we pass it string interpolated again. And for the sprite, well, that is just going to be a hard-coded URL, and that's going to be dependent on the Pokemon's ID, essentially. So we can see here, all I'm going to do is pass in this big string that leads to our Pokemon, and all I'm going to do is pass their ID in. Oops, this should be coming, and we need to also add Pokemon ID up here as a parameter that we're passing in. And what else do we got going on here? So Pokemon ID is being passed in. Whoops. All of these have to actually be inside the actual function. Sorry about that. So we can go ahead and just pop that straight into here and get rid of what we just added there. So here we go. So the sprite is going to just be the link to this Pokemon API like static content, and then the ID is just going to be there. So you'll see here, for example, when I add the card media now, so let's go ahead and add our card media right above the content. When we add it here, it is essentially going to show it. Now notice how it's not centered. For that, we're going to add a class called card media over here. Card media, and all we're going to do is set the margin to auto, and that will center the image in the center of the card pretty much for all of them. And there we go. Now we have essentially individual cards with the names, or sorry, the images of the Pokemon on the card. The next thing we can do inside of our card content, we can switch out the high for pretty much regular content. So we're going to import typography from Untitled UI. If you're not familiar with typography, I have videos on that as well, but it's essentially just a place where you can put text. And all we're going to do is we are going to have the ID and then the first their name with the first character uppercase. Now, in order to make this whole first character uppercase thing, you can make your own function for that. Since there's no built-in JavaScript function to do that, it's pretty simple. Essentially, we're just saying name is just going to be replaced with the name, and the first character is just set to uppercase, and then we append the rest of the name back to it. So now you'll see if I save it again, we'll have it like that. And also we're going to give it the same treatment where we're going to have the card content have text align center, so it shows up in the center. So up here we're going to add a custom class here called card content, where text align is center, and our card content is going to have the class name card content, so that the text align is center. And this is pretty much the beef of what we have for this page here. Now the next thing we have to do is we have to make it so that when I click on one of these cards, it's going to go to the page with that ID. So if I click on Bulbasaur number 1, it'll go to /1. If I click on Pokemon number 7, it'll go to /7, and that way we can get the information from there as well. So what I'm going to do to do that is essentially the first thing we're going to do is just go into our card over here, and we can give this an on-click property. So we can say on-click, we're going to give this a function, and that function is just going to do something called a history push. History.push, and then, history.push, and then that, okay, so it's just going to be push, and then it's going to be / and then the Pokemon's ID. So Pokemon, we're going to do some interpolation here. Pokemon ID. And what that is going to do is whenever someone clicks on a card, push, so push is something that comes from essentially history, and to get access to that we can just destructure it from props from our Pokedex. So we do const history equals props. Essentially what it's going to do is it is going to set the URL of our application to whatever the Pokemon's ID is when we click that card. And it looks like I have an extra brace here. Let's go ahead and delete that. So now let's see if this works correctly. I'm going to go ahead and just set the URL back to normal. And when I click on this one, there we go. It pushes us to number 2. So we're going to come back here, and I think this is, for the most part for this video, we are essentially done with this component. So now let's work on actually getting the data in here. Well, one way to do it is we could pass the data in as a prop to that component, but we have to remember someone could also land on this page on our website by just typing in the URL /1, in which case we wouldn't be able to pass in the data from a previous component that we're calling it from. With that in mind, we're going to make it so that this will actually get data from the API by itself, independently of the other component as well. For now, like I said, we're still just hooking it up with the mock data. So let's go over here and let's structure everything very basically. So, and like I said, I'm going to make this page, it's going to look very bare bones so that you guys will be able to sort of mess around with it and make it your own once you've pulled down the code. So the first thing we're going to want to do is we are going to essentially create, so we're going to get rid of all of this stuff over here. We have the Pokemon ID we want, so the first thing we really want to do is just get the data from that Pokemon in there. So we can say const Pokemon, we'll create another state variable, Pokemon, comma, and then set Pokemon will be equal to use state, and then what we're going to do is we have the Pokemon ID, so we're just going to get it from the same place. We'll import mock data over here, and then in use state, the Pokemon data is going to be equal to mock data of the Pokemon ID, and that will get us our data. So now that we have our data, let's start writing a function that will actually help us display it. And the reason we want to keep this functionality to actually display all this in a separate function and not just put it in the return, you'll see more of it in the next video, but we are going to have a couple of different conditional things that we want to display here based on whether or not the API request went well. And keeping the actual JSX that will be rendered on the page if it goes well in a separate function is actually a bit cleaner in the render function, in the return function. So let's go ahead and just make a function, and we can call it something like, for example, generate Pokemon JSX. So generate Pokemon JSX. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to look at all the information we need and destructure it out of the Pokemon object. So in this example, we need the actual name of the Pokemon, the ID of the Pokemon. We need the species of it, the height, weight, the types array, and then finally this little sprite that we see up here, a URL to the sprite that we see up here. So we can go ahead and destructure all of that from the Pokemon data object that we have. And also for this for this image over here, we're gonna get that also from a static link that they have on their site, and that one's coming from this site right here. And pretty much it's just the same. The only thing that changes here is the ID, depending on the Pokemon. So, and finally, the last thing we have to destructure out of here, if you look at the mock data, you can see here that in our sprites object, we want up here to display the front default sprite. So we're going to destructure that from this sprites object right here, just like that. Now we can go about actually returning proper JSX. So let's, first of all, let's replace this. Let's just keep some placeholder stuff here, and we can in here just call generate Pokemon JSX, and we're not returning anything, so it won't use anything. And let's also remember to import useState properly. So you can see here the page should still just be blank. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to import typography for all the text, and we're also going to import a couple of other so actually let's just start with typography first. So typography from Material UI core. And now we pretty much just want to display everything in a very simple manner. We just want everything to be on top of each other. It's not going to be too crazy. So what we're going to do is the first thing is we're going to have their ID, their name, and then this image over here. So, and the sprite on the top right. So we can come in here, we'll create a return for this, and we can put all of that in here. So first of all, we're going to have the typography variant equals h1 for the title. We're going to have our ID, and then we're going to use our to first car uppercase function again. And then we are going to display this little sprite up there, and that's going to be the end of it. We're actually putting the image in the typography, which is sort of cool. Now, you'll notice here that this to first char uppercase is sort of in this function, and since in this component, and since we want to be using it, since we want to be using it in more than one component, we can go ahead and put this into its own either utils function, or I'm just going to make a constants.js file and put it in here and export it, and then I'm going to import it into both files. So I'm going to import is it a default import? It is not. So import to uppercase first char uppercase from /constants, and I'm going to have this in both files since I'm using them in both files. Oops. One here, one up here. Alright, so let's see what we have so far. Bam, we pretty much just have the title. The next thing we're going to want to do is pretty much add the image right underneath it. And you'll see here, whoops, we got to wrap these in some fragments so it's not the top level child. You'll see here that the image, it's pretty basic. I'm just adding a hard-coded width and height to the image, and just adding the source over there. The next thing we're going to add is pretty much a title for the Pokemon info, which is also just going to be typography. So we're using the H3 variant, which is smaller than the H1 variant down there. The next thing is I want a header for the species, and I want the species to sort of also be linkable, because for whatever reason there's a link to it in the API, so I figured it'd be cool to add that in. And you'll see here that I am importing link from Material UI as well, and you can see here you could actually click this and it'll link you to the actual API for the species. So if you wanted to look at that, feel free. And then the next things are pretty basics. We have weight, height, and the header. So the next things are weight, height, and the header for types. So I'm going to add that in here. All just typography, nothing really special. And then finally, what we're going to do for types is actually, if we look at the mock data, types is an array of objects. So I'm just going to map through the types objects, and for each one of them I'm going to destructure the type and the name, and I'm essentially just going to display it here. I'm going to destructure a type from type info and the name from type info as well. As you can see here, we have the type and then the name of the type, and there's also a URL, but I didn't want to add that in. And there you have it. That's essentially let me go back to that. That's essentially all that this really is over here. So when we click on a Pokemon, it'll give us all the information, display all this data, and show us its types at the back. And we have everything working with mock data now. So in the next video, we're going to go over how to pretty much replace all this mock data with actual API calls. And then after that, we're going to be on the last video where we make that little search functionality up here work. Oops, up here work as well. Thanks for watching, and I hope you guys are staying safe. And if you found value in this video, once again, please consider liking, subscribing, and leaving a comment on what you'd like to see next. Thanks again.